Hello and welcome. My name is Andrew. I'm your host this evening. This is Season 3, Episode 40 of Conservation Conversations, coming to you live from BirdLife South Africa's head offices in Johannesburg. And with no further ado, we head on to tonight's main presentation. I'm going to introduce our two speakers for tonight. The first is no stranger to those of you who tuned in last week. Alan was talking about the Ostrich Journal last week. This week he's joining us to talk about atlasing. For those that missed it, Alan is a conservation biologist and attempts to use his statistical skills for good. His love of nature was cemented through volunteering in Pilanesberg National Park as a teenager, and a career in the natural sciences followed, with an undergrad at Wits and graduate studies in Manchester and the United Kingdom, but with fieldwork in the Peruvian Amazon. His PhD on the macaws in the Peruvian Amazon was partly sponsored through citizen science projects, the Earthwatch Institute and Biosphere expeditions, and so it's no surprise that he is a big fan of citizen science. On returning to South Africa, he immediately enrolled in SABAP2 as a participant before postdoctoral research work through the pits saw him using the data in various ways, which he continues to do now in his position with BirdLife South Africa as our Science and Innovation Program Manager. Also joining us tonight is Jessleena Suri. Jess is a PhD student with a passion for urban ecology. Though originally from New Delhi in India, she's been living in Cape Town for the last 12 years and studying towards a career in conservation. She is interested in how we can make our cities into functional ecosystems and provide habitat for urban wildlife, with a particular focus on birds. Her current PhD research is focused on comparing patterns of bird diversity in different South African cities using citizen science data. Her previous research has looked at the impacts of urbanization on urban raptors and the importance of urban river catchments for bird communities. And one last little personal connection that I'll add in is that Jessleena and I were part of the South African Youth Africa Birders team that went over to Champions of the Flyway event in Israel quite some years ago now. I think that was 2016 there, Jess. So some wonderful experiences that we shared together. So before I give the floor to Alan, I'm just going to ask both Alan and Jess to turn their cameras on, just check that they're still with us, and also unmute themselves if they can. Great, I can see you. Let's start with Jess. How are you doing, Jess? Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks so much for having me. It's very exciting because when I was about 14, I had a very embarrassing blog called Conservation Conversations, or some variation of that, now I can't remember. So it's quite sweet that it's come full circle. But yeah, it's good to be here.
Wonderful, thanks for joining us. And Alan, how are you doing? You keeping your spirits up during load shedding?
Yeah, I've never been so disappointed that there isn't load shedding, because now I can't do my conservations by candlelight joke. So yeah, still got power this side. Good news for us tonight, I guess.
All right, we're holding thumbs that you stay with us. And also, before we kick off, we have prepared a fun little poll that we're going to run now. I'll just put it up here and launch it. So those of you in the audience tonight, you should be able to see the poll wrapping up onto your screens now. The question is, what is your best reason for atlasing? And Alan, I found this incredibly difficult to choose one, but we'll go through the options. Why not? It's contributing to science, contributing to conservation, it gives meaning to birding, it adds competition to birding, it's a way to demonstrate dedication to birding, to explore new places, to connect to others in the birding community, and a way to usefully use my OCD. Alan, have you voted for that one yet?
Yeah, trying to.
All right.
Hope I'm not the only one.
No, you're definitely not. So we've got about 50 people that have answered the poll. We have quite a lot more than that tuned in, so we'll just give people another 30 seconds or so. Jess, what's your favorite reason to become an atlaser?
I mean, I find the OCD one very amusing, but I think it's a combination of the science and giving meaning to birding for me.
Yeah, wonderful.
Mm.
So I
Part of the reason for breaking apart the contribution to science and conservation is because I think that was lumped as a single reason in the recent poll that Sanjo and Ernst gave to contributors. So want to delve deeper on that one.
All right, well, you've got some interesting results coming out that way. I'm going to take inspiration from your picture on screen now, Alan, and say it's a way to explore new places. I've personally gone atlasing in places I would never otherwise have have ventured to. So I find it's a great way to go and explore new parts of this wonderful country. Okay,
Definitely, and to meet new people. Atlas
absolutely.
Bashers, which you've already punted.
No, we haven't even
Great place to.
we have to connect to the rest of the birding community. So there we go. A couple of people have voted for that, but I'm going to call it there. I think we've had enough opportunity for you all to participate. So the results are an interesting mix. So I think the two standout ones there, Alan, contributing to science and contributing to conservation. So it seems a good thing to tease those apart. I know everyone has to choose one, and many people would have ticked both if we're giving them the option. And then Jess, your other alternate there, giving meaning to birding, seems to have come in third with another chunk of the votes. So thanks everyone for participating in the little poll. That was some good fun and gives Alan and Jess some context before they give their presentation. So with no further ado, Alan, if you would like to take us away.
Thank you very much, Andrew. I'll just share the screen. Oops. Share the presentation rather. And it's a great honor to be talking about this passion of mine tonight. So thanks again for the opportunity to be here. And I really love SABAP2, and I want to talk about the celebration of not just SABAP2, but what it's also created across the rest of the continent, the African Bird Atlas Project. And this talk isn't just by me. It's there's a part of this from everybody who's used BirdLife and who's contributed to SABAP2 project or any of the other African Bird Atlas projects. So Africa is a continent with some extraordinarily beautiful birds, exciting birds, big birds, little birds, brown birds, colorful birds. It is an awesome destination for international tourists to come birding in. There's something for everybody, great diversity. But of course, here on the continent and in South Africa, like the rest of the world, our beautiful birds are under threat. I'm not going to walk through all of the threats on this slide, kindly put together by Shamiso Banda, but there are many interacting effects of how we're impacting the planets and the birds that we share our environment with. So, as a conservation unit and conservation organization, how do we go about addressing these threats or finding out about these threats or finding out about the magnitude of these threats? So the academic in me should be saying, well, we should be doing science. We should be saying, okay, we've got a bird, looks like it's not doing too well or might be doing well. We need to design an experiment. We need to go out into the field. We need to collect data. We need to come back, analyze that data, synthesize that into a research report or a manuscript and publish that, which will then, of course, in turn result in new questions. That rigorous process can be very difficult to do. It's both costly and expensive. And in a world that we sometimes feel like we're having to hold together, and as a conservation unit, we can feel very alone. How do we deal with all of these species and all of these threats that we need to address to inform conservation decision-making and species areas management? And one of the solutions is citizen science. Citizen science isn't just bird watching, it's planet watching, insect watching. It's manifest in very many different forms, and anyone can contribute very easily these days and help contribute to monitoring and science and conservation. Juliet Vickery is the CEO of the British Trust for Ornithology, and she's a big fan of citizen science. A lot of what is used in order to understand and manage birds in the UK stems also from citizen science. So there's big support from leading conservation and research organizations across the world for citizen science. In a world where we sometimes struggle to understand what is truth and what's not truth, where does citizen science fit into the big picture? So what we have essentially on our end of the decks is data. So data isn't proof of anything, but it can be considered to be evidence of a trend or of something that's happening or unfolding. Phoebe Barnard and Maureen de Villiers captured it very nicely in their title, Biodiversity Early Warning Systems, South African Citizen Scientists Monitoring Change, where they referred to data contributed to the South African Bird Atlas project, as well as to SAFRING. But like all citizen science projects, or data generally, one needs to be a little bit cautious with how you interpret the results. Nonetheless, that offers extraordinary insights into the world of birds around us. So a little bit about SABAP2, which will be the focus of my talk, just because I'm based in South Africa and I know that data set slightly better. Sometimes there's some confusion about the terms that we use when we meet as atlases or talk about atlasing, the act of contributing to the Atlas project. And you might have heard the use of the term BirdMap. So BirdMap is the protocol that we follow when we're contributing to the Atlas projects. This is our rigorous format of going to the geospatial area of a pentad and spending between 2 hours and 5 days actively looking for birds. SABAP2, the South African Bird Atlas project, the second one, is an implementation of the BirdMap protocol. And if that's all sounding complicated, there is a recent publication that's just come out, published in that great journal Ostrich, where you can read all about the details of that. And SABAP2 is part of the African Bird Atlas project. So that's together with the Nigerian Bird Atlas project and the Kenya Bird Map. So independent organizational entities which manage the coverage and encourage atlases in their part of the world. BirdLasso is today the most popular way for contributing data to SABAP2. However, it's important to bear in mind that this is third-party software developed and maintained by Henk Nel, who provides all support, complementary, so that you can use easily a tool to contribute, well, keep your lists and contribute to science and conservation. So SABAP2 formally started in 2007, kicked off by the Animal Demography Unit, championed by Les Underhill, managed by Doug Hairbottle. And compared to the first Southern African Bird Atlas project, up till now, it's only had half the number of contributors. Right now, there's quite a lot of competition for other citizen science projects, so we've got fewer contributors today than there were historically in the past for the first Atlas project. Nonetheless, 2,500 observers, only probably of which half contribute regularly, have submitted over 300,000 lists. Yeah, all these little greater than signs are greater than, they're not bullet points. So that's resulted in 17 million records. South Africa has achieved 82% coverage. So that's 82% of over, well, roughly 17,000 pentads, which is a very large number of geospatial units to visit and discover. And the proof of saying that this project is one of the most important for conservation and science is the number of times SABAP2 is referred to or the data is used within the scientific literature. Well, not just the scientific literature, but also by environmental impact assessments and widely referred to in popular literature, websites, etc. This chart also shows that the use of that data isn't slowing down, that is used almost more and more increasingly as that data becomes more and more accessible and the value of SABAP2 is appreciated beyond just South Africa, but across the continent and globally. The theme of my talk tonight is to underscore the value of this data for conservation. Within the Science and Innovation Program, we have been tasked with undertaking the Regional Red Listing Project, which is deciding what is the conservation category for a species based on IUCN categories and criteria. Basically, it's the informed process to decide how endangered a species is and suggest management actions to improve the status of a species. So this results in conservation categories, which you would have heard of. For instance, white-winged flufftail was classified as critically endangered in the 2015 listing. African penguin is endangered, black stork is vulnerable, Cory bustard is near threatened, and most other species are least concern. Thanks to the incredible bird watching community, so you and the bird watchers around, no species in South Africa are classed as data deficient, and none have been classified recently as extinct. Tables are always terrible things in presentations, so I apologize, but again, we're just going to look at the colors here. For our purposes, to decide if a species is endangered or maybe just near threatened or species of least concern, we need to find out how many there are of a species, what's the range of that species, so where are the species, what's happening to it over time, and why it's happening. These can all be encompassed by the questions and the comments here in the blue box. So to answer all of these questions, the column in gray, which refers to the SABAP2 project, indicates that we can get an indication of how a species is doing almost exclusively using SABAP2 data, but augmented very importantly by BirdLife data and comparisons also with the first Atlas project data. So we get very far just with SABAP2 data. So the SABAP project was designed to try and tell us where are birds across the country, and then to tell us how birds were doing over time. So looking at a distribution, we can see very quickly where a species is found across a continent or across the country, and then also how it's doing. In this particular slide, we're illustrating various metrics of change based on reporting rate. So reporting rate is simply the number of times a species occurs on a set of lists. In this publication by Sally Hofmeyr, together with Craig Symes and Les Underhill, they introduced a statistical measure called the Z-score, which allows us to account for how much change is happening, accounting for the number of bird lists which are being contributed to a grid square. Comparing between SABAP1 and SABAP2, we can see that there's been a large decline for secretary birds across the country. There are various other metrics that derive from reporting rates. Another example is the C-score, which tries to account for the fact that it's a non-linear relationship between reporting rate and abundance. And so differences should probably be log transformed. So while we had a depressing situation for secretary bird, it's very easy to go to the SABAP2 website and find some species which aren't doing that badly. So an example would be this one here, colonizing into the Western Cape and into the Karoo, all along the Western Free State, along the Orange River. And I guess for anybody trying to guess the species, there might be a few candidates, but this one is the hardy-dar, loving what we're doing and how we're transforming the landscapes around us with our lawns and agricultural landscapes. So that's comparing between Atlas periods, so 1987 to 1992 being the first Atlas project, and then the more recent period. Of course, we can also just look within SABAP2 because it's been running since 2007 and see how reporting rates are doing by year across time. This is an example of some Karoo bird species, and we can see that their trend lines are fairly stable. They're just getting on with life in the Karoo. No big changes there. But because SABAP2 has been going on for such a long time, we can also split SABAP2 into the early period and the late period. So like we've done comparisons between SABAP1 and SABAP2, all lumped together, we can split SABAP2 into an early period and late period and use the same statistics which were designed to compare between atlas periods. So the map on the screen at the moment is the distribution change map for the Boerte's lark, comparing between SABAP1 and SABAP2. Traditionally, red is used to score species which are doing poorly or regions which are doing very poorly. And maybe it's a bit hard to see how that species is doing across that map. But just looking at the percentage difference bar, we can see that the red zone dips a lot deeper. The problem with the 1/4 degree grid cell, it's very big, perhaps 600 square kilometers compared to the 70 or so kilometers of a pentad. So one might get the false impression that, well, it's doing badly, but it's fairly widespread. So if we do the same thing using just SABAP2 data, we suddenly see that the situation is perhaps very dire for Boerte's lark. So the percentage change is very dramatically bad for the more recent SABAP2 period. And we can see that the range as defined by records from SABAP2 is very, very small. So if you can, do help us conserve the species by reaching out to someone at BirdLife South Africa. This one needs a champion. In another paper, just out in the recent special issue on Africa's Eurasian birds, this is the species which is doing most poorly according to these reporting rate change metrics. But perhaps you say, well, these reporting rate change metrics, they're very simplistic. They don't account for things like who the observer is, sites and seasons. Well, for that, we have a special class of statistical models known as occupancy models, and Jessleena is going to talk to us a little bit about those in her presentation. But they're basically models that account for the detection process, as well as the process determining if a species is present or not. And there are various kinds of occupancy models, so dynamic occupancy models, detection, non-detection occupancy models, or time to detection occupancy models. And we can use all of these using SABAP2 data. So as an example of what we can produce using these, this is a dynamic occupancy modeling result, which looks at the colonization and extinction probabilities for the common starling. The blue line is the probability of colonization, and it's higher than the red line, which is a probability of extinction, which is very low. And it's an expected result. We know that the species has been colonizing across South Africa. And we can compare that to another species, say southern bald ibis, where those lines dance across each other, the error bars overlap. Perhaps in some years, southern bald ibis is doing better than in other years, but basically the probability of recording the species in a pentad in one year is very similar to it not being recorded in a pentad in a different year. Continuing using southern bald ibis to look at the data that we need in order to classify a species as to whether it's a species of conservation concern or not, a fundamental metric is extent of occurrence. This is the bounding box that covers all the known points from which a species has been recorded. It's a conservation measure that can sometimes if a species is spread over, so it's not range. CN purposes are within a 2 by 2 kilometer grid. In this case here, in the map, the gray bounding box is the extent of occurrence, and the little orange blocks are the 2 by 2 kilometer grids, which indicates or add up to the area of occupancy. And from this, we can then calculate these two measures, which are very important for IUCN red listing purposes. Also very important is we need to know how many birds there are. SABAP2 wasn't designed for this, and it's a little bit of a challenge to translate a reporting rate into a density estimate or a population estimate. But we have explored this for various situations using an allometric equation for Karoo birds. And this year, a very influential and clever modeling system using Bayesian statistical techniques by Patricia Cervantes, Marley Martins, and Rob Simmons also use SABAP2 data to produce a population estimate as well as a population viability assessment, showing that black harriers are decreasing at about 2% per year. Similarly, we've used probability surfaces to calculate a likely population for black stork, and finding that this is a species which is probably far less common now than it was in the initial assessment. On this slide here, we can look at contributions to the project by month over time. The color gradient represents the start of the project, with the contributions between 1,000 and 2,000 per month, full protocol cards per month, contributed until the introduction of BirdLife. With BirdLife, contributions almost doubled, and we're seeing between 2,000 to 3,000 cards a month. What's incredible for me is just how sustained this has been over time. We realize this is a big challenge, and we do want to encourage you to continue contributing, because this data will be very valuable for the red listing process. Again, in this table, we can see the impacts of lockdown in 2020, where submissions dropped, and we're very grateful that those have picked up again, and thank you for your contributions. And I'd like to give a special shout out to those contributors who are in the top 1,500 full protocol card club. I like to think that they've developed a good habit. We've got 20 or so atlases who've cracked over 2,000 cards. Someone who thinks they contribute a lot, so I'm on 450. Looking at these numbers, it's just really awe-inspiring. The amount of time and money that's being poured into contributing to this cause is truly humbling. If you're on YouTube sometime in the future, please do feel free to have a look at this and just thank everybody who's contributed so much of their time. From the data scientist point of view, the Atlas project is also fantastic. Thousands of lines of data from which we can do various things. For instance, painting a map of South Africa using greater striped swallow as it comes into the country, or splitting up the barn swallow reporting rates by year, and marvel at how repeatable it is over time as it comes and goes. We're looking at local species and just trying to see how that moves between seasons. And we're looking at the seasonal patterns from a spatial point of view here for European roller, here in summer, and then gone in winter. So I'd like to recap on why SABAP2 is so important, science, conservation. I think first and foremost is the rigorous data collection protocol. The fact that we encourage atlases to go wide as well as deep. If in doubt, leave it out. That we can also trust the data from the SABAP2 so much better than we can from alternative sources, due to the rigorous vetting and the sometimes painful out-of-range forms that we have to deal with. And the proof of how valuable it is the alliance of institutions that support the project. So it's hosted by the Fitzpatrick Institute at the University of Cape Town, Michael Brooks and Sanjo. Up until recently, chaired by Peter Ryan. And it has the support of SANBI, which for many years funded the project, and currently with Aaron Stratif driving the coordination from BirdLife South Africa's perspective. The value of the project, the fact that it's been running for so long, is so valuable that we have, as I've said, ×2 long-term data sets here. We've got the first Atlas project, we've got the second Atlas project, and we've got the fact that the second Atlas project has been running for so long. We can see how it's been used in science, that there's a track record of it being useful. And it's fun, not just from a data collection or adventure point of view, but also for creating fancy charts, etc. In my closing slide, I really want to emphasize the you in the thank you. This would not be possible without all your contributions. If you use BirdLasso or you contribute to SABAP2, if you haven't yet, do think about it. If you're perhaps not confident enough to contribute to SABAP2, you can at least start using BirdLasso, and in that way, you also play a part. Thanks to my sponsors, Mikapa, Italtal, and Afritz, for hosting my position at BirdLife South Africa. And with that, I hand back to Andrew, or on to Jessleena.
Thanks very much, Alan. I'm going to move swiftly on to Jess, and then we'll take the questions for both of your presentations right at the end, if that's okay. So Jess has pre-recorded her presentation, so I'm just going to open that up on my side and we'll kick off. So the presentation is slightly soft, so I do suggest that you all turn your volume up as far as you can. And yeah, I'm going to hand it over to Jess now, and we're going to have a listen to her presentation. A reminder, please do put your questions in the chat box so that we can keep track of them, and we'll get to these at the end of the webinar. Thanks.
Hi everyone, thank you for joining this evening, and thank you so much to BirdLife and to the SABAP crew for inviting me to do this talk. My name is Jessleena and I'm a PhD student at UCT through the statistics department, but I've been at UCT for quite a while and across a few different departments, the biology department as well as the environmental science department. So my research interests are quite transdisciplinary, but specifically I'm focused on urban ecology and particularly urban birds. Previously I've looked at how urban rivers like the Liesbeek River here in Cape Town can impact bird communities and the value that they add to a city. And at a more species level, I've also looked at black sparrowhawks and how they might be benefiting from urbanization. I first want to talk a little bit about urban ecology because I think many might look at a picture like this and say, what ecology? And rightly so. In traditional conservation, cities have generally been shunned and seen as a lost cause. It's not something that conservationists are concerned with. But the reality is that cities are the main engines behind global change and biodiversity loss, and we can no longer ignore them. The reality also is that over 50% of the world's population now lives in cities, and this is expected to be closer to 70% by 2050. So it's increasingly clear that we can't expect to put all our hopes on these isolated pockets of protected areas when they exist in the sea of transformed land. And we also now have to engage with these blurry areas in between where people live and where wildlife lives, especially because many of these areas are rich in biodiversity. For biodiversity, the impacts of urbanization are countless. It's a complete transformation of habitat from the natural surrounding habitat. So the habitat loss and fragmentation is the most extreme impact. But as a result of that, we see things like extinction of native species, spread of alien species, and then the more kind of physical impacts like catchment hardening, which is a fancy word for concrete, and all kinds of other things that are impacting biodiversity in ways we probably haven't even detected yet. On the flip side, we also know that cities can actually hold significant biodiversity in between all of that concrete. They're far from anything natural, but they can still support ecosystems that are at least functional. And preserving these green spaces within our cities is not only beneficial to biodiversity, but there's several knock-on effects, and it can also significantly mitigate climate change and also promote human well-being. There's a lot of research to show that green space is important for mental health and general quality of life. So urban ecology research is really focused on understanding these spaces and how we can make them more sustainable. But understanding urban ecosystems is a challenge in itself, because each city is completely unique in its age, history, and form. There's a lot of literature already from cities in Europe and America, but that might not be applicable to us here in South Africa, or say to a city in India, because patterns of urbanization in the global south are completely different to the much older cities of the north. So there's still a really big need for studies from cities in developing countries, because they are still rapidly growing, and also because they sit in biodiverse areas generally. So within urban ecology, to understand the impacts of urbanization, birds have been the most studied taxa, and they're often used as indicator species. They're kind of this Goldilocks taxa because they're diverse, but they're not too diverse like the more cryptic species like insects, for example. They're also relatively easy to ID, and they're conspicuous. We know a lot about birds' ecology, so we can make inferences about what's going on. We also know that they're very sensitive to habitat change, and they're mobile. So basically what this means is that if a habitat's unsuitable, they can leave very easily. So the presence or absence of a certain species can be a really good indicator of urban ecosystem health. But on top of that, birds are charismatic and they're noticeable. They capture people's interests, and it's a perfect recipe for citizen science projects, which in turn can then feed back into further research and conservation. So by studying birds in human-dominated landscapes, we can begin to understand broader ecosystem impacts, as well as the more fine-scale mechanisms of how biodiversity responds to such a complete habitat transformation. So urbanization affects birds and other species at different scales. I'm more interested in the community level impacts and understanding what allows such diverse communities to sometimes persist in cities. But the impacts go further down as well, and to understand what individual species may be responding to, that then requires finer scale research. And at all these levels, there's been an explosion of literature on urban birds. And from all of this research, we now have a few well-established ideas about how bird communities respond to urbanization. So firstly, with increasing urbanization, we generally tend to observe a reduction in species diversity. And again, this is obvious because of all the habitat transformation and disturbance that I mentioned. But as a result of this, what we see is ecological filtering. And this occurs because it's generally a specific set of species which are lost. It's the more tolerant ones, the more sensitive ones. And then you end up being left with the more tolerant ones. And the two of these can kind of come together to create this phenomenon known as biotic homogenization, whereby urban communities in different areas can start to look the same and lose their uniqueness. I have just included these little pigeons as an example of filtering and of reduction in species diversity in Cape Town, for example. So on the left, you'd have the more sensitive things like the makwa doves. But as you get closer and closer to the city, those ones start to drop off. And at the end, all you're really left with is those guys on the right, the usual suspects that we're all very, very familiar with. So my main aim in this chapter of my thesis was to compare bird communities in South African cities and to see if they conform with these globally observed patterns that we've seen. I also want to know how they compare with each other. So for example, I mean, I can already we can guess at this already, but is it the case that we see most of these species in all South African cities? And it is the case with pigeons, but with the other species, there may be a lot of other stuff going on that we can't see. So this is where the SABAP data comes in. A large-scale standardized database like SABAP is ideal if we want to compare cities. I think a lot of hardcore atlasers might be irritated looking at this map and seeing all those sapling gaps in the middle of the country. But for me, this situation is ideal because the data also happen to be concentrated in cities, which is where the atlases are. So as great of a situation as this is, having this much data comes with great challenges too. And I can confidently say that half of my PhD has been spent data wrangling and getting these data into a format that I can actually analyze in a robust manner. So this is why I'm in the stats department, because citizen science data definitely needs special handling. And just to explain this very briefly, there's this problem called imperfect detection. So in analyzing presence-absence data like the SABAP cards, a birder may go to a pentad and fail to detect a bird on that card, a species on that card, but that doesn't mean that that species doesn't occur in that pentad. So when we want to extrapolate and now look at patterns of species occurrence across pentads, it's not just a simple matter of presence or absence, and we need to take the observation process into account also. And this is called hierarchical modeling. And just in the time that I've been doing this PhD, there have been newer, better models developed for doing exactly these kinds of analyses. But specifically, I'm looking at multi-species occupancy models. I've taken out the scary stats and equations from this presentation, but just to explain my models quickly, we want to together estimate the occupancy probability and the detection probability of each species. To estimate occupancy, it's generally the environmental variables that are affecting occupancy. And in this case, I'm interested in the different types of urban land cover. And these are derived from the national land cover layer, which is taken from satellite data. And then to explain detection, I've just looked at the number of hours spent birding on a given card. I've only used the full protocol cards. And this then gives us an occupancy probability for each species in each pentad. And these can then be used to derive information like alpha and beta diversity and functional diversity, which I'll get into just now. So for my study, I'm looking at South Africa's big cities, and I'm looking at Cape Town, Durban, Johannesburg, and Pretoria. And in each case, I chose a large area, which includes all the pentads that contain the city, the main urban area. But then I've also chosen a good little area around the city to also capture the natural habitat that surrounds the city. For each city, I chose a set of species, focusing just on those which are relevant in an urban ecology context. So removing things like seabirds, obviously, and just things that obviously I know wouldn't occur there. I'm not including water birds because if there's water, there will be water birds. So it wasn't part of what I was interested in. And I've also excluded migrants because this specific type of model is only looking at one season. So if you start to look at a longer period of time, then you kind of need to use different techniques. And so I've only looked at 2016 to 18 because those were the years with the best coverage, the most number of cards for those pentads, which I selected in all cases. South Africa is a really strong system to test this and to compare different cities, because all the cities that we've considered are located in very different biomes, all with very different regional species pools. Actually, initially I was kind of looking at Gauteng just as one, because there's this lovely big square, quarter degree, I think it is, where there's been this drive to get a lot of sampling done. And we know that Joburg's a very sprawling city with a lot of little satellite cities around it. So I had initially looked at this whole area, but once I put it on this map and realized there's a really nice, neat split between savanna and grassland there, I decided to do Pretoria and Joburg separately. But yeah, before doing this kind of study would have required separate surveys, probably in different countries or different continents. But I don't have to look beyond the country because we have such diverse habitats already, and I can do it all with one data set. So the power of citizen science data and the scale of it really can't be overstated. So just to explain my study design schematically, I first wanted to look at each city individually and compare it to its surrounding landscape to see whether there's a reduction in species richness and that ecological filtering, like I mentioned earlier. Species richness is all I mean when I say alpha diversity. There are other measures of alpha diversity, but I'm not looking at them in this presentation. And when I say urban and rural, I've taken the 5 most urban pentads and the 5 most natural pentads, or the 5 least urban pentads. If homogenization is truly occurring, the literature suggests that communities in urban areas should look very similar to each other, even more similar than to their surrounding landscape. So that's what I then wanted to look at when I compare cities to each other, comparing the urban parts of each city and the rural parts of each city. I then also wanted to look at functional diversity and split the species into their different feeding guilds and to see whether they all respond whether they respond consistently across different cities, or if some do better in one city and not the others. The literature suggests that it's generally insectivores that suffer the most in cities, and things like scavengers and grazers and granivores that tend to do better in cities. So I wanted to see whether that unfolds in South Africa and whether it unfolds for all of the cities. So for this first part of the results where we're comparing the city with its surroundings, the results were quite surprising. We found that for all cities except for Durban, the urban areas were actually more species rich than the rural areas. And this is actually really surprising, especially given that we chose the most extreme examples in each case. We chose the most urban pentads. So yeah, I was a bit worried initially about choosing only 5 pentads, but it does actually, regardless of how many pentads I chose, the same result held true. So it's only Durban where we're seeing the expected pattern of urbanization decreasing diversity. For Joburg and Pretoria, it's not that extreme, but in Cape Town, it's really surprising that the city is so much richer in diversity than the surrounding area. There's a lot going on this slide, so I'm not going to go into it in too much detail. If you watch this again on YouTube, you can give it a pause and have a proper look. But if we then look into the functional groups, splitting the species into their functional guilds, and then seeing which functional groups are contributing the most to the patterns that we observed in the previous slide, we see for Cape Town that it seems to be raptors and scavengers especially, and that's not surprising. Scavengers are known to do well in urban areas. The raptor thing, especially in the case of Cape Town, is very interesting, and it's also something that I found in my master's thesis, that it seems like cities are actually just really, really good for raptors because there's such diverse habitat and prey. And then just to pick out a few more things, generally the responses seem to be the same across functional groups in each city. And we also see that the insectivores in the 3 cities except for Durban are also doing well in cities, which goes against what we know from the literature. So it's just to show that here we can kind of pull out which species are contributing to those patterns. Then we looked at this difference in terms of beta diversity. Beta diversity is just a way of literally comparing the difference between 2 communities. So it's a dissimilarity index. And we found that beta diversity, when comparing urban and rural within a city, was really quite low, and that was consistent for all cities. So generally, the cities look quite similar to their surroundings. But beta diversity can be split into 2 components. One is called nestedness, and the other is turnover. If we're seeing a lot of nestedness, then you would expect what I explained in the beginning with that filtering. You would expect that the urban subset, the urban community is kind of like a filtered subset nested within the rural community. Whereas if it was turnover that was happening, then we would see that kind of each urban and rural both have a unique set of species that doesn't occur in the other. So we can dig into these kinds of community dynamics. And we found it's pretty inconsistent, and I also can't see what's behind my face there. But in the case of Durban and Joburg, we were seeing more turnover. So both kind of have their unique set of species. And in Cape Town, we see almost completely nestedness, but it's in the opposite direction to what we would have expected. So this means that, as we kind of figured from the previous slides, that the urban pentads in Cape Town have a lot more species that don't occur in the surroundings. Then we compared the cities with each other to get into that homogenization hypothesis, and we compared all the city pairs. the urban parts and the rural parts of each city. And if homogenization was happening, we would expect to see very low beta diversity here. But it's not the case. The cities are quite distinct from each other still. So it's almost like they're still retaining some of their uniqueness. But maybe it could be that it's the early stages of homogenization happening and it hasn't really taken hold in South African cities yet. But also, it could be that homogenization is also actually just happening at a much larger scale than just the city level, because when you compare rural and rural, that's also not very different. You would expect them to be quite a lot more distinct from each other. So that's not happening either. So that also makes me wonder if homogenization isn't happening at a much larger scale. And there is evidence for this from SABAP as well, because we have plenty of evidence of these kind of range expanding species in South Africa that are coming quite dominant across the whole country. So maybe that could be at play over here. Here I just wanted to kind of give an example of the area I chose, a closer look at the area I chose for Cape Town, and also just an idea of the kind of figures you can get. So the one at the top is species richness, and the orange is more diverse. At the bottom, that's urban cover, and the black ones are the very urban pentats. You can also get these species, you can also map occupancy probability for each species and get these same kind of maps to see where a species is most common. So there's really a lot you can do, because, I mean, even though I'm only looking at the community level thing, like alpha diversity and all of that, we can then go into the individual species responses as well. And then here, this is just the same maps for Durban. Again, I'm kind of in the way of most of that urban cover map, but you can see that the species are not concentrated where the city is, as we saw before. So just to tie this all together, I think my main finding is that South Africans don't seem to be conforming with the expected patterns of urban areas being very species poor. We also don't seem to be seeing homogenization yet. It could be that it's still early stages, or it could be, as I said, that it's happening at a much larger scale. So I think this is just something that we'll have to keep an eye on. But what's clear is that the surrounding biomes and the diversity of biomes we have in South Africa has a big impact on the urban communities and creates these differences that we're seeing. A caveat with using SABAP data for urban ecology studies is the size of the pentats and the size of South African cities. In terms of the pentats, it is a very coarse scale, and we can get these snapshot pictures of the community, but a lot of the processes that are determining which species are there could be happening at a much finer scale. So this is something that I'm looking at with the rest of my pieces, and there's a whole chapter just about Cape Town, which I'm super excited about, because clearly from these results, something very different is going on in Cape Town. And then in terms of the size of the city, most South African cities are very small. I wanted to include more cities originally in this chapter, but these were the only ones that had enough pentats to really dig in. A lot of the others were really small, like only 20 pentats. So then you're limited by how much data you can really look at. And then finally, I say all this, but also the analyses you can do are kind of limited by how good that environmental data is. And in my case, that land cover data, it is limiting. And so there's still a lot more really cool remote sensing data and associated analyses that are coming out. And so it's a very exciting space that will keep growing. And to just continue that thought, I just wanted to really drive home this point that this combination of birds, cities, and citizen science is really just a golden trio for urban ecology research. Birds really are the ideal flagship species for urban conservation. They really capture people's interest, and the mere fact that we have so many atlases contributing to SABAP data is proof of that. I think birds are also really important, and citizen science is really important in fighting this thing that's called the extinction of experience. And that is basically just about how most people, their only experience of nature will be in the city. They don't have much exposure to real nature. So the more we bring these experiences into our city, the more we can maintain those connections with nature. And then, as I said, the opportunities for further studies are just endless, and I'm really excited to see what else will happen in this space. Thank you so much for listening. I'll take any questions that you might have, and you're also welcome to pop me an email if you want to chat further. Thanks.
All right, thank you so much to our two presenters this evening, both Alan and Jessleena. It's been really lovely listening to you and just hearing again the importance of this Atlas project, both SABAP and African Bird Atlas Project, ABAP. I don't know if anyone actually uses that. Alan, if you are still with us. Yeah, it's been really valuable to see, of course, the role that this data plays, and just validating again for all the atlases out there that your work is important both for science and for conservation in terms of understanding birds in their environment. So yeah, thanks. It was a very rich and interesting and scientific presentation from both of you. I certainly learned something despite knowing a fair bit about the Atlas project already. But yeah, thanks to both of you for your time. Yeah, wonderful to have you both presenting this evening. Thank you. So, of course, before we get on to the questions, do post all these in the Q&A box so we can keep track of them. I saw a few coming into the chat box, but we're going to be taking all of our questions from the Q&A box as well as the comment feed of Facebook if you're watching us there. Also, do remember to tune in next week. We have Dr. Giselle Murison and a couple of her colleagues talking about our estuarine systems and the conservation thereof. So that promises to be a very interesting presentation. And we'll get on to our questions now, if the two of you are ready. Alan, I'm going to start with you. There was a few during your presentation. And there's one just to start off with from Eleanor Mary, who picked up on something when you were talking about secretary birds and you had the graphs for their distribution out there. And she'd like to know that fairly large hole in the northwest of the map around the Northern Cape. What is that, and what are the implications of that for the Atlas project and the secretary bird?
I'd like to start off on an optimistic note and say that it's an opportunity for adventure. We always got to leave something uncovered so that there's more to explore. The secretary bird maps specifically were just the raw quarter degree grid cells where there was and were not data. But in this day and age with statistical modeling, using occupancy models or artificial intelligence, it's actually quite easy to predict through these gaps, especially in homogeneous landscapes such as the Bushman land and the arid zones in the Northern Cape. So it's less of a problem now that we've got such good coverage than it used to be. Looking across the rest of Africa, though, where we have massive gaps, and glad to see we've got some interest from the gentleman from the Gambia. There we do have more of an issue because we've got a lot more heterogeneity in the landscapes that we need to predict into, and that creates problems. So across Africa, we still need a lot more data to make good predictions across the continent for our species.
Yeah, there was another question from Rob Simmons on a similar note to what you just mentioned there about can we submit previous cards from areas outside of SADC, for example, Angola, and where would one submit those cards if they've been keeping Atlas protocols?
I believe that they can still be submitted through the usual submission system using BirdLasso and then submit, but pretty sure that data would be accepted into the African Bird Atlas project. So even though we don't have, like, say, for instance, a Cameroon project, we've got data from there, from Chad, from all sorts of countries across the country. So it doesn't matter if there isn't a bespoke atlasing project, the data will all be curated at the Fitzpatrick Institute.
Great, thanks for that. Yeah, there's been a couple of interesting questions from Rob here in the Q&A. One of them, Jess, talking about the effect of domestic cats on urban bird diversity, but we won't open up that bag of worms or bag of cats. But there was another question from Rob, which I'm going to direct towards you, Jess. You mentioned that Cape Town is sort of bucking the trend, and Rob was wondering what effect does it have that Cape Town's a very green city with a massive national park in the middle of it, obviously Table Mountain National Park. Does that have an effect, and did you account for that?
Yeah, absolutely. I should have gone more into that. I mean, that is basically the explanation that I have come up with for the patterns that we're seeing. I think that contrast between the city's landscape and the surrounding landscape is very important, but also Alan just mentioned this as well, where heterogeneity in the landscape will mess with your expected patterns, and cities are extremely heterogeneous, very, very patchy kind of matrix habitat, whereas surrounding fynbos is actually quite homogeneous in terms of structure. It's obviously the most biodiverse kingdom, but in terms of structure and in terms of bird diversity, it's pretty homogeneous. And yeah, the same would be, I see a couple of people ask the question in the chat about Joburg, with it being called the biggest man-made forest in the world. It's that contrast between the urban habitat and the surrounding habitat, which is, yeah, again, with grasslands, quite homogeneous. Durban is surrounded by 3 different biomes. And so there you do see that the city, with all its disturbance and stuff, is having a negative impact, which isn't buffered by this landscape effect that we're seeing for the other cities.
Very, very interesting. Thanks for sharing, Jess. Alan, back to you. There's a few questions here about how does one get started in atlasing, and also is there some way to find out more about how to use BirdLife? Would you like to speak to that?
Sure thing, Andrew. BirdLife is quite easy to use. You just go to Play Store and download it. Quick little registration step, and you're up and running with your bird listing. In order to contribute to SABAP2, you do need to go to the website and register there as well. You then enter that into your BirdLife app, and then you can connect those 2 databases or submit your cards to SABAP2. In terms of actually using the app, there is an instructional video, I do believe, hosted on the SABAP2 channel. And Sanyo, hopefully in the audience, is already sharing the link for getting started with SABAP2. She can answer some more questions.
Perfect, thanks, Alan. Yeah, we'll look out for that link from Sanjo. Yeah, Ted's asking, is there a chance that we can have a conservation conversations episode on using BirdLife? And I do believe when Ernst did his presentation, it was earlier this year or late last year on atlasing and citizen science, there was an inclusion on BirdLife and how to use that as a tool. But Alan has also pointed you towards an instructional video, which we'll be sharing in the chat very shortly. So there's a few messages here. Sanyo has posted them in the chat. So it's on the sabap2.birdmap.africa website, and you can just go to the how-to page on that website to find the video and how to become an atlaser. As easy as that. So for those of you asking in chat, how can you join SABAP? How can you start atlasing in Gambia? That is your answer. Wonderful. Okay, Alan, I'm going to stay with you for one more question before I go through it back to Jess. Try and share this around a bit if we can. Another one from Rob Simmons. He'd like to know, following on from Pachi's clever modeling using detection, non-detection, occupancy models, will BirdLife be using that approach to get accurate population estimates for Booterslark and bald ibises as well as other rare species?
Great question. Clever modeling, of course, steered very much by Rob. So if you're willing to assist, then we certainly can. I have tried playing with these models with Booterslark, but unfortunately there's not enough data. And that species is so scarce that we can't actually use these models. Or even like simplistic models, simplistic statistics struggle to tell us what's going on there. It's just really just disappearing to the point of trying to do statistics with zeros, which is, yeah, not going to happen. But we are collaborating quite closely. Well, we've started collaborating with Pachi in order to get his insights and his clever expertise into guiding the red listing process, meeting him in December. Of course, he's been working quite heavily with the Birdie project using the quack data, and he's been developing the ABAP package. So very useful person, and really incredible to see what was done there with Black Harrier. We would have known that it was possible to do that, so well done. Seminal paper.
Oh, fantastic work. I'm hoping to build on that for sure. Jess, there's a question by Ted here, just on the Cape Town situation again. And he's asked, maybe a bit tongue-in-cheek, are Cape Townians just not logging birds in their gardens and their urban spaces and not really doing the rural areas around them? You know, more broadly, I think there might be a point to speak to about atlasing biases, and people may go and atlas certain areas in a pentad that are more fun to bird, have more birds, and neglect areas like maybe urban areas that only have pigeons and house sparrows. Is that something you've taken into account? Is that happening?
I don't think it is a case of that. I mean, again, I think it's just actually that surrounding the surrounding habitat is actually just quite species poor. I also should have mentioned Cape Town again is quite unique because it's not entirely surrounded by like immediately fynbos on all sides. There's also this huge agricultural belt, which is unlike other cities, and we've got vineyards within the city as well. So yeah, there's a lot going on in Cape Town. But the issue about access within a pentad, I think most atlases know that you have to cover the whole area and not just sit in one spot. I would hope so. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I remember, and Jess, I believe you were a part of this when a group of friends in Cape Town put together a Strandfontein challenge, and we were running around the two Strandfontein pentads because that is unfortunately split down the middle by one of these pentad boundaries. And we were also going into areas outside of the works, into Philadelphia, into some of those agricultural small holding areas, and picking out birds like red-capped lark, which just hadn't been reported at the Strandfontein sewage works. But a lot of birders will go and spend 2 hours at the sewage works just logging water birds and some of the brush birds that you can find around there. So yeah, it does, I guess, speak to the need for atlases to visit as many habitats as you can within those pentads and try and cover as much ground as you can, even if there are areas that you would consider sort of less favorable for birds and birding. You can uncover some incredible things there, and it produces better data at the end of the day for science and conservation. Would you pretty much support that, Jess?
Yeah, definitely. I think that covering all habitats is really important, but of course it is really difficult in an urban area because you may have a park there, as you say, there may be farmland in one spot, there may be a huge property that you can't get into. I've had many of those problems with access. So, I mean, it's understandable, and especially in South Africa where there's walls everywhere, and yeah, it's not so easy.
For sure. Alan, you must know all about access and atlasing. How do you handle that situation when you're out and about in the Karoo and needing to get onto farmers' private land?
Yeah, but it's certainly a mixed bag, but I'm brave enough to be friendly and ek praat die taal, so ons kan vriende maak en 'n bietjie koffie drink en 'n beskuit eet, and so people get interested, and in the Karoo, any company is good company, so it's quite easy really to get onto some of these farms. I'm not too sure about knocking on doors in Cape Town, probably a little bit harder. Someone's got a nice garden.
I have friends who were working in the Karoo on species like jackal and caracal and going around these farms, and it was a particularly pretty young woman who was doing this research project, and I think she had about 4 marriage proposals from Karoo farmers. She was moving around the Karoo. Shame. We've got another one from Rob here. Directed at you, Alan. Jess, if you have any insights, please feel free to share. He'd like to know, were there any effects that you guys know of hard lockdown on garden bird communities? Do either of you have any insights into that?
No, I haven't used the SABAP data to look at that question specifically. Maybe Jess would have insights.
I haven't looked at the SABAP data in this context, but I think I know what Rob is getting at because he's been asking me these questions. But it's also worth saying because there are a lot of names in the audience that I recognize from those lockdown garden counts that I did. And I just want to, another note about citizen science. I mean, the work that Hank and Michael Brooks and Renee Navarro have done for SABAP, it really is incredible because it's no easy task wrangling data when it comes in such numbers. And Michael's actually currently helping me with my lockdown data. And he kind of just laughed when I said, you know, it was a spreadsheet where things could be changed. And yeah, so I'm still working on tying together all of that data, to be honest. But I'll have an answer about gardens, lots of interesting answers about gardens in a couple of months. Yeah.
That's
and cats.
interesting.
And cats.
We'll have to take you on for another webinar next year, perhaps, to talk about that other subject, because that would be very interesting to get those insights. Last couple of questions here. One for you, Jess. One from Annalie Blockema, who's just sharing some interesting information. She's asked if you're familiar with the National Parks City Foundation, the NPCF. London in the UK was declared a national park city due to more than 50% blue and green areas. Thus, the NPCF is a significant role player in the conservation of the urban planet. Have you heard of that before? Do you have any comments? Obviously, Cape Town's a great example of a city with a national park inside of it, but I don't know if it's officially declared a national park city.
Yeah, I'm a bit confused by this. I heard about London being declared a national park city, and it's an amazing initiative what they're trying to do. But does it have a national park within it? I'm a bit confused by that. But for sure, there's something to be said in general for cities that have national parks within them. There's not that many, so Cape Town's pretty exceptional. And yeah, I need to look more into the general foundation, but I think it's an amazing initiative, and every city should be taking on something like this.
I mean, there was a comment as well from Alimutu who was saying, you know, we need to rethink conservation and urban areas, and data like yours is starting to show that urban areas also need to be conserved because they do hold, in some cases, incredible biodiversity. Not only birds, which are a great indicator, like you said, but of course places like Cape Town have incredible botanical diversity as well, and they've just discovered a new species of orchid on the Rondebosch Common, which is, you know, a very well-known piece of land in Cape Town, that suddenly this critically endangered new species is discovered. So we do need to think about urban spaces when we think about conservation.
Definitely. Yeah. But I see that the next, not the next talk, but the one after is also an urban one. So that's very exciting from Shane. Yeah.
Yeah. And we'll finish up our year on the 6th of December with the talk from Doug Haybottle on birding in and around Kimberley. So we've been focusing on birding around our cities for the last year. Yeah, so it's been really incredible to see how South African cities stack up. There's a last one here. Ellen, I guess this is towards you. Again, Jess, if you have inputs, just shout out. How has atlasing reflected invasive species like the Indian myna and ringneck parakeet? Is there anything that you can sort of comment around that and the ability of atlas data to track these species?
Indeed, interesting question, and SABAP2 has been really useful for providing ecological insights into the colonization processes of invasive species. So that's been the work by Jess's supervisor, Rez Altwig, who looked at environmental factors influencing the colonization. I think it was the common myna. Yeah, I mean, I used the common starling or European starling as an example of an invasive species to illustrate how we can use occupancy models to look at colonization and extinction. Craig Symes also had a student who looked at SABAP data to examine the influence of cavity nesting ringneck parakeets on other cavity nesting birds, finding that they were basically living together, I think, for the most part, fairly well. So no negative influence yet on those, but again, these stories often take a long time to unfold, and with continued contributions to the SABAP2 project, and with perhaps increasing competition from other nesting species, we might get a different story in the future. But yep, SABAP2 very useful for monitoring invasive species.
There was a lot of media attention earlier this year on the common miners and the invasion into the Kruger Park. That's certainly something I've observed myself, and it just sort of brings us to a nice point to end on, I guess, about how important that Atlas data is, because we can show now in the last 5 years how that invasion has just sort of exploded into these areas, and it's also centered around the camps and picnic sites. So obviously human influence is having a big role to play in the invasion of these species. So we need to think about that and what the solutions or preventative measures might be. Just out of interest, Jim has just confirmed that London does have a national park. So I guess that sort of rounds that out.
I'm still wondering which one is it though. But I also wonder if my notion of a national park is maybe different.
Yeah, there probably are different definitions across different countries.
I'm gonna look this up as soon as we're done.
Some I'm reading for you, yeah. All right, I see Sanjo's just shared some more scientific papers using SABAP2 data as a link there for those who would like to go and do a bit more reading. But yeah, that sort of brings us out to the end of the evening. It just remains for me to say thank you very much on behalf of our audience, to the two of you, for giving your time, sharing your insights or experiences in your presentations with us. It was a very enjoyable evening. I certainly learned a lot. I'm sure everyone else appreciated that too. And yeah, thank you very much. And we hope to get you on to some more future episodes next year, perhaps.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. It's been a wonderful another episode. This is the 40th episode this year, about 120 down over our 3 years. Next week, we of course have another webinar all the way through until the 6th of December, which will be our last for the year. So we do hope to see you in future weeks. Until then, good night, stay safe, and yeah, keep your eyes on the skies. Good night.